This old book is one of a series of encyclopedias about animals, first written in Latin in the 17th century. It's a book for scholars of natural history. 50 years later, this smaller version was made and brought up to date by an Englishman called Edward Topsell. In its own day, it was immensely popular. Children were given it to see the pictures and learn about the wonders of nature. So almost all the copies got worn out and just fell apart, like I'm afraid my copy has. This is a very rare one. So on the front page, Topsell set out in his title in rather grand way, in which they did in those days. He called it A History of Four-Footed Beasts and Serpents. And among the chapters describing quite ordinary four-footed animals like tigers and zebras, there is a chapter about serpents, including a section on dragons. In those days, dragons, serpents, and something they called boas were all very much muddled up and all considered equally terrible. This is how Topsell begins his description of dragons. Among all the kinds of serpents, there is none comparable to the dragon, or that yieldeth so much plentiful matter in history for the ample discovery of their nature. And he goes on to amplify how much had already been discovered of the nature of dragons, though he seems to have been quite confused between dragons and serpents. Listen to this. The dragons get and hide themselves in trees, covering their heads and letting the other part hang down like a rope. They watch till the elephant comes, and then they do clasp themselves about his neck and beat and vex the elephant until they strangle him. In the jungle, very large snakes, like pythons and boas, can drop on their prey from trees, though scarcely in such a highly coloured manner, nor would they get very far, I'm afraid, with an attack on an elephant. But the world of the real jungle was far, far away from the scholars of Europe. Serpents and dragons were reptiles and therefore considered by the scholars mysterious. But perhaps those men had heard strange stories from the East about flying reptiles and imagined the rest. Not long ago, when I was in the jungle in Borneo, I met several different kinds of flying reptiles. This is the flying lizard. Superficially, it looks just like an ordinary little lizard. But in fact, its ribs are prolonged into the flap of skin at its side, and it can spread it out to form a little gliding membrane, like that. Normally, however, when it sits on the trunk, it has this gliding wing folded by its side, and then it is so beautifully camouflaged that actually it's very difficult to spot. But their great trick is gliding. Watch this one. That was a glide of about 30 feet. Of course, the higher up you start, the further you can glide. So as soon as they land, they scamper upwards. They can steer as they fly, too, by flexing their ribs in the membrane. And so, to some extent, they can land on the tree that they want. This is the paradise tree snake. It's small, only about as thick as my little finger, and it's interesting to notice that its middle coils are not much fatter than its neck or its tail, because this is the legendary flying snake of Borneo. As far as I know, the first film record of something that some old Borneo hands have dismissed in the past as being a very good reason for giving up drink. And there's one more superb glider in Borneo, which is, according to the textbooks, mainly nocturnal. One evening, we noticed a particularly large tree with a hole in it, high up on its white trunk. Holes are always interesting. They're potential animal homes. And there were 3 hornbills perched just above it. For a moment, I thought it was their nest hole. Then, down on the left, I noticed a black silhouette. As I was still wondering what that could be, a huge chestnut-brown rectangle as big as a doormat sailed over our heads and landed on the same big tree. It had come from some trees on a hillock 100 yards away, and there was another of them scampering up the trunk to get a high takeoff. It seemed that we had, by accident, come across the central flying squirrel playground of this part of the forest. From then on, they treated us to a display of the finest gliding gymnastics I'd ever seen. However much they might have got themselves a greater reputation in travellers' tales, those small, harmless creatures of the jungle treetops hardly make the grade as the venomous winged dragons of history. But in the past, to Europeans, the East was full of jungles, and jungles were full of mystery. And the East was where all the most wonderful stories of strange gods, rare jewels, and fearful monsters had always come. Marco Polo had said that in India there was a kingdom of mountains where in all the world diamonds are found and nowhere else. And those diamond-bearing mountains were infested with immense serpents that lived in dark caves and were exceedingly venomous and noxious. So serpents became a symbol of fear. They lived in dark holes and they came to represent darkness and evil. People from Britain and the northern countries who had never seen any large snakes but only heard stories about them had to make do with imaginary serpents. So dragons and serpents, poisonous reptiles and the devil were all intertwined and all mysterious, and like giants and monsters, they made good stories. In Yorkshire, near Whitby, there was once an old and very famous abbey. It was first started in the 7th century by the daughter of a king whose name has come down to us as St. Hilda. She ran the abbey and she seems to have been a very powerful woman. But there's one odd story told about her. Most astonishingly, so the story goes, the grounds of the abbey at Whitby were once infested by hundreds of serpents until St. Hilda prayed, and at once the snakes turned into stone and their heads dropped off. And here are some of these stone serpents. Big ones and little ones, they come in all sorts of sizes. Of course, I expect you know what they really are. They're fossils, ancient petrified sea creatures. These are called ammonites, and you can dig them up in various parts of England, just as you can find fossil shells and fossil sea urchins and other remains where millions of years ago the land was once part of the seabed. Now, of course, we know all about fossils, but once it must have been only too easy to think of ammonites as headless, coiled stone serpents. Before science had discovered the real origins of fossils, they were collected just as curiosities. In fact, right up until 1949, the British Museum still had a mysterious cabinet of curiosities in which unknown fossils were kept. I've got my own collection of fossils, my own cabinet of curiosities. And these are some of them. There are some I'm particularly fond of. These are fossil shark's teeth of a giant shark, probably 60 feet long or so, that lived about 20 million years ago. Sometimes things like that were made into jewellery. They were called tongue stones or St. Paul's stones, and if you wore one round your neck it would protect you in battle and even make you irresistible to women. And here is just such a piece of jewellery. It's got silver on the end here, silver mounts, and it's got a silver pin at the back, and was probably made about 100 to 150 years ago in this country, and I found it in a junk shop in London. But in fact, it's just a fossil fish's tooth, like that one. And here's something else I bought in a shop, but not in London. I bought this in a Chinese medicine shop in Borneo, and it was sold to me as a dragon's tooth. In fact, it's probably the tooth of an ancient kind of horse, but the local people believe it's a tooth of a dragon and have it ground up to make a particular form of medicine. But dragon's teeth are very popular. Indeed, right up until recent times in the valley of the Shanxi River in China, the peasants would work on their farms in the summer and then dig for dragon's teeth in the winter. Chinese dragons were much nicer than Western ones. They were considered a good luck symbol and were meant to live in the sky among the clouds and bring the rain. Their voices were said to be like gongs sounding. Perhaps it was this friendly Eastern dragon that the Englishman Topsel had in mind when he wrote, "There are dragons of sundry colours, and their shape and outward appearance is very beautiful." In most Chinese communities, once a year, they hold a dragon festival, It's like a carnival. And men dress up as huge paper dragons and parade along the streets, and all the children rush around throwing buckets of water at everyone and shouting, "Here comes the rain." Of course, some people think that the crocodile could have been the dragon. They're fierce and horrible enough, but there was never anything particularly mysterious about crocodiles. Even in ancient days, a lot was known about them. They were called the egg-breeding serpents.
The biting of the crocodile is very sharp, deep, and deadly, so that wheresoever he layeth his teeth, seldom or never followeth any cure. The tail is the strongest part. They never kill any beast or man, but first of all they strike him down and astonish him with their tails. And therefore the Egyptians did signify death and darkness by a crocodile's tail.
The Egyptians made gods of their Nile crocodiles. Their temple priests would decorate them with gold bracelets on their paws and jeweled rings in their ears. And the Romans knew all about them too. Their soldiers went hunting on the River Nile, and the Emperor Tiberius Caesar had a pet crocodile and fed it with his own hand. No one ever seems to have got these crocodiles confused with legendary dragons. But in some of the old Roman histories, they talk of another kind of crocodile. They describe it merely as a land crocodile, a giant lizard. And it was some more modern stories of an unknown giant lizard that lived in a remote part of the East Indies that once set me off on a hunt for what I hoped was a live dragon. Back in 1910, there had been reports of a large flesh-eating lizard from an island near Java called Komodo. It was a small island which had very rarely been visited then, but the native people said that the giant lizards lived in caves deep in the heart of the island. They said they were very dangerous and would eat deer and pigs and even human beings. And then in the 1920s, an airman whose plane was forced down came face to face with one. He said that it was huge, like a dragon. Well, then several European explorers visited the islands, some to shoot the dragons, some to bring specimens home in order to show them in zoos. And way back in 1956, I set out with a cameraman to try and put the dragons of Komodo onto film.
We lit a fire and roasted some goat's flesh, not only to create a smell which we hoped would attract the dragons, but also to give us the first square meal which we'd had for some days. I had bought some coconuts in their green husks to provide a drink to go with the meat.
So I had caught my first dragon, and after examining him, I let him go. But if I hadn't been able to make a film of that trip, if I had just come home and told my dragon story, and other people had told more dragon stories about my story, perhaps that giant Komodo lizard might have developed into a dragon like St. George's dragon. St. George's story has been told so many times, it's hard to discover if there was ever any truth in it at all.
In a certain country, they suffered exceedingly from the attacks of a fierce and insatiable dragon. Each year it demanded a sacrifice until the time came when it demanded the king's daughter for its victim. Fearfully, the princess went out to meet her fate. It was then that a Christian knight came to her rescue. He told the princess to take the girdle from her waist and place it round the dragon's neck, and then the beast would not harm her. She led the dragon back into the city, and there, in front of all the people, St. George fought and killed the dragon.
The English armies of the Crusades brought back that legend from the East, and over the years, St. George became a battle cry for other English armies, until eventually he became St. George of England. It didn't seem to matter whether he was real or not, but perhaps at least his dragon was some fairy tale version of my own kind of Komodo dragons. In Topsell's book, he lists yet another kind of dragon, and one that he calls the fire dragon. He says it destroys the fruits of the earth with a certain burning fire in the air, and sometimes on the sea and land, which it did 12 years ago on the western seas. Well, that was written in 1658. But only 2 years ago, on the coast of Iceland, there was another certain burning fire in the air. Do you remember when the new volcano of Jaime Island suddenly burst into life? In the old stories of Icelandic heroes, they often describe a sleeping dragon that lives underground and suddenly wakens with an earth-shattering roar, like the dragon in the story of Beowulf.
The creature began to spew fire and burn dwellings. The light of burning filled people with horror, and the flying monster spared no living thing. It surrounded the country with fire and flame, and then flew back to its secret hideout. Filled with anger, Beowulf set out to find the dragon. He caught sight of its cavern full of swirling flame and shouted out his challenge. The dragon roared with rage at the sound of the man's voice. The prince stood his ground in the shelter of his great shield, while the flaming monster hurtled towards him. Beowulf struck at the glittering dragon with his sword, but his blade failed. The dragon took fresh heart, and spitting flame, he ended Beowulf's life. But when day broke, the dragon that had killed him lay there, crushed and lifeless.
On Jaime in 1973, no one was killed. But even though we know a lot about volcanoes and can predict their movements and know when and where they're likely to come to life, we still need to know more. Each new eruption is a battleground for more scientific knowledge and, as old Topsel put it, a more ample discovery of the nature of fire dragons.